Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sam James. I'm president of the parish board. And we want to welcome you to the second town hall meeting. The first one was back in May. And the purpose of this is to update you on the status of the church and the things that have happened over a very busy summer. And now as we begin into the fall. We have an excellent panel to talk about the most important parts. And I want to give you an overview of the agenda, and then the panelists will move from one person to the next. Eleanor Hobbs is a member of our COVID task force, and she is going to talk about the COVID task force and the recommendations that have been made to the parish boards and subsequently the church. She will be followed by Jody Renoff, and Jody's piece is a little bit more complicated. We have found, because of COVID-19, that coronavirus's best friend is the sanctuary. Sitting side by side, talking with one another and singing is a major form of transmission of any virus. We also know that the primary way we get ventilation into the sanctuary is by opening a window. In effect, we have no real ventilation or filtration in the sanctuary. In looking into this, we have also found that the parish hall only has ventilation and filtration when either the AC or the heat is turned on. So for the past 2 months, we have been looking at a retrofit design that would make the church building safer upon our return whenever coronavirus is over. And Jody has a schematic and information in terms of bringing you up to date with that. Because of the FCB Forward campaign, we have sufficient funds to do renovations to the church. And Bob Corning, who is a member of the Property Care Committee, will be talking about the renovations that are planned. Part of our thinking is, while the building is closed, get as much done as we can so that we don't inconvenience the staff or our members. And so for the next few months, the building will be rather busy, but with a lot of workers. Martha Reed is our treasurer, and she will discuss the closing of last year and the first quarter of this year. It is my job to tell you about the goals of the parish board. They're very simple: manage COVID and manage our finances. And the people on this panel are going to be giving you a wonderful background and understanding of how we intend to go about both of these. You will notice at the bottom of your screen, you have a Q&A button. If you have a question, click on that, and Reverend Jablonski will be fielding questions. Some he can answer immediately, and other he will refer to a panelist upon the completion of everyone's presentation. So we are glad to have you here. This is a most important time. I'm glad we have an opportunity to update you. And now I want to turn it over to Eleanor Hobbs, who will fill you in on the COVID task force. Take it away, Eleanor.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Sam. Sam asked me to give this update, and I'm reporting on behalf of the church's COVID task force. And I'll just name the other members. They're Reverend Chris, Sam James, Lori Graham, Eva Patalis, Jody Renoff, and June Lattimore. We met twice over the summer, most recently in mid-August, to discuss plans for the coming year. We recommended to the parish board that, based on the current state of knowledge in mid-August regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, we would keep the current policy that we had in place over the summer, at least until the end of the calendar year 2020. The current policy is the following. There will be no in-person worship, committee, or other group meetings inside the church buildings, including rental of church buildings to outside groups. Church members and officials have access to their individual church offices, provided that they adhere to wearing masks, physically distancing, and liberal use of hand sanitizing and surface cleaning. Contractors and their employees in the building shall adhere to these same guidelines. Church-sponsored gatherings of members and friends held outside of church buildings, such as in members' yards or in outside public spaces, should adhere to the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and CDC guidelines, including the wearing of face coverings, physical distancing of at least 6 feet, except for within a family bubble, frequent use of hand sanitizer, limiting the size of groups, and not sharing food. The COVID task force will meet again in mid to late October to assess the impact of local students returning to schools, if they do, and out-of-state college students returning to the Boston area, as well as the effect of cooling weather and shorter daylight time on the spread of COVID-19 in our area. We expect to make a recommendation to the parish board regarding the remainder of the church year at that time. In all likelihood, we will continue the current guideline in the winter and spring of 2021. We are aware that churches have been and have the potential to be super spreading events, a summer wedding in Maine, a funeral on the South Shore of Boston, and a choir practice in Washington State are well-publicized examples of churches being the site of a super spreading event. While our church buildings are closed, the parish board is taking this opportunity, as Sam said, to address the environmental conditions in our buildings, which increase the spread of respiratory pathogens, including SARS-CoV-2 virus. I want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that it is especially important this year to get a seasonal flu shot against the normal seasonal influenza, as this will, in all likelihood, also prevent further spread of SARS-CoV-2 with coughing and sneezing. At this time, I'm going to turn the program over to Jody to discuss the challenging environmental conditions in our church buildings. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jody Renoff. I'm a member of the Property Care Committee and also on the COVID Task Force with Eleanor. I'd like to talk to you about the ventilation at First Church. As Sam had expressed earlier, there are some opportunities for improvement that are needed at the church, and I'll get into those in a little bit more detail. First, I want to give you a little bit of background that we have retained an engineer, a mechanical engineer who we worked with in the past, and the church has had very good success with, to look at the church from a holistic perspective of how the spaces are used, which spaces are used, and for how long at a time that these spaces are used, and to make recommendations based on those facts. And he's going to help us come up with a good game plan, as well as some budgetary cost estimates that are expected in October for the improvements that are being proposed or options being considered. So with that in mind, we'll step into some of the topics of the ventilation at First Church. So first of all, the addition, which was added in the early 2000s, has provision for outdoor air ventilation. It was built to current code, and the current code has not changed much in terms of the amount of ventilation recommended for occupied spaces, be they classroom use, gathering use, kitchen, etc. And that area still presents some improvements for us that are needed, mainly in an operational standpoint. The equipment is there. It is not new. It has been in service for 14, 15, 16 years at this point. So we're also going to be looking at the possibility of replacing that equipment. So we're looking at all angles, and as Sam had mentioned, the sanctuary does not have any outdoor air ventilation other than the windows that open, which presents a pretty limited amount of time that we could possibly use those, as well as the area of those windows not being as much in terms of square footage for the air changes that would be recommended by current code. So that's the big focus of the next slide that I'm going to show you, which has a little bit of the schematic of what's being proposed. COVID guidelines, as Eleanor mentioned, to avoid these super spreader events. Outdoor air ventilation is a big part of it, as well as making sure that what you are running in terms of air handlers are actually doing what they're supposed to, and the filters are cleaned and checked on a regular basis. Everything is maintained. But beyond that, there isn't a big change to the code based on COVID. There are recommendations, certainly operational, most of them just simple operational guidelines. what we are working with the engineer on and what he's provided us with so far is a memo that describes some options for the various spaces in First Church. And so one of the options that we're going to talk about next is ductwork to the sanctuary to get some air flowing through there from a mechanical system. And then some addition of some controls to the parish hall. Sam had mentioned that the parish hall only gets ventilation when the temperature is either above the AC set point or below the heating set point. At that point, the air moves around, but other than that, it doesn't. So the classroom air handlers are also going to be looked at, and any kind of office air handlers in terms of operation and possible replacement. This is how the church is currently set up. Right now, there are 2 air handlers on top of the roof of the loft. One of them serves the kitchen and the upper gathering hall, and the other one is specific for the parish hall and handles heating and cooling in that space. These are both mixed air units, which means that they take return air from either the parish hall or from the kitchen and upper gathering hall, those are the purple lines there, and feed them back into the air handler to either be cooled or heated. And then the blue arrows that are shown on this schematic are the outdoor air vents that open up or set at a fixed position in the case of both of these units to provide the minimum amount of outdoor air for a healthy space. That's currently how this is all set up. And the engineer has a good recommendation of using some of this equipment if it's possible to be used, and that again is being assessed, to repurpose the air handler that handles the kitchen and upper gathering hall. So in this picture, that's at the top, it's a rectangle there at the top, and extend ductwork in through the upper gathering hall ceiling into the sanctuary by installing some kind of a vent or register in the sloped ceiling of the sanctuary that would take that air from the air handler above the loft, provide heating and cooling for the space as well as fresh air, making this a source for fresh air for the space. And in order to balance the sanctuary, the air has to be relieved. So the air coming in is relieved out of the space, and there would be an exhaust fan in the attic of the sanctuary on the opposite side of the sloped ceiling area that would take that air out. And so you would end up with an air change that would be meeting current ventilation standards, as well as possibility for all the filtration that the upper gathering hall kitchen air handler provides. So that's what's currently being looked at for the sanctuary. The parish hall is a case of having a unit that's well maintained, recently had a major service a few years ago for heating, and would be essentially a controls change would take place so that there would be scheduled occupancy time and a sensor in the parish hall that would let the unit know when the parish hall is occupied and allow for air changes to take place and ventilation to take place while people are using the space. That's irrespective of whether the space needs heating or cooling, there would be fresh air changes. So that's kind of the goal with the controls piece that would go with the parish hall unit. And then other units, as I had kind of mentioned, are going to be looking at the classrooms, that air handler, going to be looking at the office air handler, making sure that it's in proper working order. Other things you see on this picture are potential addition of mini split heat pumps. You guys are probably familiar with the technology you've seen at various places for heating and cooling, where you're taking air from the kitchen and upper gathering hall that would normally be used to cool and heat those spaces. We need to make up for that additional lost cooling or heating to maintain those spaces at a comfortable temperature. And so adding heat pumps in those areas may be a great way to do that. Similarly, in the parlor and in the minister's office, that's kind of also being considered. So this is sort of where we are at right now with a very preliminary memo from the engineer. As I said, cost estimates, everything of that nature, more details and options are coming in October. But we are essentially looking at not only the sanctuary and parish hall, but making sure that cooling is maintained in the upper gathering hall and kitchen, and then proper air to the classrooms, and all the air changes are happening and filters being changed for staff offices and other locations in the church. So as I said, we'll look forward to more information as it unfolds on this subject, but I want to pass the baton to Bob Corning to talk about some of the other property care measures being talked about.
Thanks, Jody. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Bob Corning. I'm co-chair of the Property Care Committee with Mike Flamang. Other members of the Property Care Committee are Jody as well as Peter Ickes. We also work very closely with the House Committee and the First Church Green Committee as well. As you may or may not remember, the Property Care Committee has been very active the last few years with a lot of support from the board. We've been able to chip away at a pretty extensive list of improvements to the church, the Johnson House, as well as the grounds, which makes up our campus. And we always try to keep these goals and objectives in mind as we're prioritizing potential projects. But as Sam mentioned in the beginning, with the buildings being vacant mostly, we think it's a great opportunity to really push ahead and try to pursue some of the prioritized projects that we've identified over the last couple of years. We've been working closely with the parish board to do that. So the proposed projects that have currently being prioritized are kind of in two buckets. The first is projects that's already been approved and are funded. We have budgets for these projects. So they include continued work on the landscape, particularly the front of both the church and the Johnson House frontage, safety and cleanup improvements at the playground. Mike's been working very closely on getting quotes and estimates for refinishing and renovating the parlor and foyer floors outside of Chris's office and then into the parlor. Currently looking at removing all the old carpeting and tile and refinishing the existing spruce flooring with some minor repairs. And then we would have area rugs and runners for high traffic areas. We've been working closely with the House Committee on that. House Committee's also been looking at doing electronic bulletin boards in the upper and lower gathering hall to help reduce some of the paper clutter that's on the walls. And then we're looking at doing a monitor for the parlor, which would improve the functionality of the parlor as a meeting space. So those are all projects that have been approved and funded, and we're trying to pursue those as soon as we can. The second bucket of projects is prioritized projects that we've identified over the last year that would potentially be funded through the capital campaign. As you might recall, a portion of the capital campaign contributions were earmarked towards building and grounds improvements. And we are hoping to get approval from the parish board in October to pursue this preliminary list. This will not use all the money that's been allocated towards the building improvements through the campaign, but it's a prioritized list, thinking about the fact that the church is open, and these are items that we could tackle immediately. Mike Flamang's been working hard on trying to get CPA funding for the clock repair in the tower. And for that to happen, there's a really tenuous ladder that's in that tower that needs to be replaced with a safer stair. So that's one project that would go a long way in good faith to the town to show that we're invested in getting that clock repaired. We're getting quotes for painting all of the interior spaces, which would be the gathering halls, parish hall, offices, and the RE wings. There really hasn't been a lot of internal painting done since the addition was done. The House Committee did a great job last year of painting the parlor. We would kind of build on that as a refresh for the interior spaces. There's some HVAC grills in the parish hall that have been beat up. They're in really poor condition, so we'd like to get those replaced. House Committee got quotes to get shades in the lower windows in the parish hall, which would improve performances. Replace the upper gathering hall carpeting, which is pretty tired. And then there's some pretty significant improvements that need to happen at the Johnson House. The roof is in really bad shape, and the trim and the eaves are in desperate need of repair and replacement in some places. So since that building is mostly unoccupied at the moment, we think it's a great opportunity to do that as well. So that's what I have. So I'm going to pass it off to, remind me. Martha.
Hi, Bob. Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Martha Reed, Treasurer. I'm going to take you on a quick tour of where things ended up last fiscal year, which ended on June 30th. And then we'll take a look at comparatively the June 30th numbers to the 2021 budget. The biggest number that we have in the income part of our budget is the pledges. And that also, not only is pledging important, but the payment on the pledges is even more important. And you see, we were extremely fortunate this year to have ended up virtually on target on budget for the pledges. And this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's due to every single person fulfilling their pledge, making their payment, taking this as a serious commitment. So we shout out a huge thank you to every single one of us for following through and making the pledges a major successful component of the budget. During last year, the excitement over Chris's arrival bumped up the Sunday offering. Rental income, as you can imagine, was down. We had lost already a significant tenant, but that happened back in the fall before COVID hit. But we also were not able to rent out the church and other facilities for any events during the spring. So that was also contributed to the decrease of income. So all in all, we ended up with only $10,000 less income than we had budgeted, which is really quite remarkable. The biggest piece of expenses, obviously, is personnel, staff, taxes, benefits, and administrative expenses. We came virtually on budget there. Buildings and grounds, as Bob mentioned, was an area that work virtually went on hold during the spring. Church being closed, nobody was quite sure how things were going to unfold from COVID. Committees were also underspent. As committee chairs or anybody participating committee can seek reimbursement. So we think probably some people didn't submit their reimbursements, and also because committees weren't holding regular events or regular meetings during the spring. That category was underspent. Religious education was overspent, but this was planned and due to the introduction of the Families Together program. All told, we ended up the year with an $8,353 surplus, which given everything was hugely successful. This surplus contribution will go to the stabilization fund, which then helps provide future funds to fund future projects or deficits. And now on to comparison here. This actual 2020 column is just what we were looking at compared to the 2021 budget. And again, it's the pledge number that's all important to make sure that the church can function, because without these pledge numbers, the church won't work. So we're counting on everybody to pull through again and make this a successful pledge year. We decreased the offering just because it's really hard to know what the effect of virtual services is going to be on offering for extended period of time. Rental income, of course, is down. What we do show here is the amount that comes from the Johnson House rental. Fundraisers were from the auction last year, which was hugely successful. And investment income, we opted at the vote of the budget and at the town meeting in the annual meeting in June, not to make a contribution to the building fund this year, but rather to leave that money in the investment and operating account. Personnel, again, is the big expense item. And as you remember, we voted a 9% increase for all staff except for Chris across the board. Debt service is the other number you see a decrease. And that's because we paid off the first mortgage entirely last year in June. And again, this was because of the success of the capital campaign. We had the funds to be able to retire that debt. The other small categories are, a lot of it is a bit of estimate, how we don't know going forward, whether we're going to incur expenses or not. So we have as realistic placeholders as we possibly can in the 2021 budget. The bottom line here is that we had budgeted intentionally a $28,600 deficit, and that money is coming from the stabilization fund, and that's the same fund that we contributed to at the end of 2020. So that money is there specifically for situations like this, which we need additional funds. So that's it. Thank you. And I will turn things back over to Sam.
If you have questions, please submit them. I see some that already have been, and I think Reverend Jablonski is going to be fielding those. So Chris, if you will, highlight the questions and to whomever they are addressed.
Perfect. So we can just kind of go through them, but Jean Mooney was asking Jody if you could say a little bit about your background and expertise, which is always fascinating to hear. So maybe start there.
Okay. So I'm Jody. My current expertise, I guess, and background is that I'm working on energy efficiency projects involve buildings. And through that, I have gained a lot of expertise just in the field and understanding what goes into maintaining buildings efficiency, as well as the health and safety of occupants, working in labs, varied types of classroom spaces. And I've been in that role for 8 years. Prior to that, I worked for an oil company, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum, for 18 years. So that's me in 2 minutes or less.
And let's see, actually, Jody. So Karsten wrote a very long comment / question just recently, but basically the first one he mentioned was wanting to know a little bit more deeply about the ventilation guidelines that have been part of the conversation with the engineers and you. So I assume we can follow up with some of those details offline, and I'll invite you, Jody, to read the more detailed comment question that he entered there while we move along to a question about from Miriam Baker around funding of all this. And Sam, you can jump in, and we're gonna get to that in a little bit, is my assumption, right? Or do you want to mention? Miriam asked, how will this be paid for? Is it coming out of the capital campaign, or what other projects will have to be deferred?
Miriam, we are looking into that. Right now, we want to get the scope of the project and know what we're looking at in different scenarios. And then we'll start to look at the cost. It's awful hard to imagine that once we get to this, that we will not have to have a special church meeting to discuss it and all the specific ramifications. So if we're hedging today, it's because we don't know, but we will come back and discuss this in detail with real numbers and get real feedback from the members of the church.
Great. And we had from Susan Kobayashi asking about the library in terms of airflow, Jody.
Okay. I guess I can start by talking about Karsten's question, if I may. So he brings up the possibility of increasing airflow could potentially increase the risk to the space and to the occupants in the space, and how is that being managed and looked at? So the question is kind of around where the air is coming from in one way of looking at it. And I want to say to Karsten in response that what's being considered is the amount of outdoor air which comes from the roof is what would ultimately be increased into the building. So at a very high level, we would be bringing in with what Rob Dawson, the engineer, has come up with as a preliminary scope, as a preliminary idea. Bring in a lot more outdoor air compared to any indoor air. So the changes to the air handler that would serve the sanctuary and currently serves some other spaces, that would bring in 100% outside air, whereas right now it brings in like 10%. So that's kind of what I wanted to get back to, is Rob is going to be looking at the mixture of air, where it's coming from, and then the amount of air changes as well to avoid the let's just move air around and spread germs among these people in this space. I hope that answers your question, at least at a broad level. But that's why we're working with the engineer. Then as far as the library is served by the same air handler that the classroom wing is served. And so that is currently an outdoor air ventilation unit that's existing. We are looking at the operation of that unit, at maintenance of that unit, and its efficacy. So those things are going to be looked at as a whole piece to that classroom wing. That's all part of the same air handler. And I hope that answers that question. If not, please type more.
Wonderful. And I believe this is probably for Bob. It might even be a one-word answer, but Jean Mooney asked, will the cost estimates include future operations and maintenance costs? And I wrote to her that I assume that the cost estimates are really for the first phase of just buying things and installing them, and then that other costs get folded in. So if I'm wrong, feel free to say, or you're nodding. All right, I think we're good then. Let's see. More Karsten. And then, yeah. Johnson House. There was an important celebration I don't want to just let pass by. Brian Copperell and Leslie celebrating Anjali and Catherine. Last year's stewardship committee did a wonderful job, and sort of dovetailing in with that, Catherine Stahlberg asked, and Sam, maybe you can explain this or just clarify it, that when we talked to everybody in June about the extra contributions of the pledges going towards staff compensation, and that was the case. But
That was the case.
yeah, that was a wonderful process, and I know I and all the staff are very grateful for that. I think we might be there. Let me do a little cleanup and we can go. Yeah. Yep. I think I'll double check to make sure I didn't miss anything, but I think we're good. Oh, yeah. So Catherine asked about coming and getting things out of the church. Did we clean out the refrigerators? And yet, yes, we did. Yeah, no, Luis has been cleaning quite a bit the whole time. And so in addition to a deep clean, and Michael, our amazing church, kitchen wizard went in and did a deep clean also. So yeah, worry not about the kitchen. I think that's it for questions.
Okay, I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts before we wrap this up today. It was Winston Churchill that said, "The truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is." I think it's a great line about truth. In the end, there it is. And Lincoln before him said that he was a firm believer in our people. If given the truth, they can be counted upon to act in the national crisis best interest. The great point is to bring them all of the facts. John Barry, the historian for the 1918 pandemic, stated that the cities that did the best with the pandemic were those that leaders told people the truth. At First Church, we're going to tell you the truth, and we're going to tell you the impact that this pandemic is going to be having on us. Some of you will ask, when will we be back in the church? And I will ask you, when will you feel safe enough to come back in the church? Personally, I'm not sure we have a safe building to come back to at the moment. And we also have to make sure that we are safe with each other. And then we can really start talking about returning. From the beginning, we have been allowing the pandemic to be our guide and to teach us about the future. We have been applying what we have learned to our leadership, to the ministries of the church, to the programming of the church, which is exceptional, and to our leadership within the community. This town hall is a statement of action that's being done while the church is in dealing with this pandemic. We are not wasting this crisis. When this is all said and done, we will be frayed and torn for sure. But I think our moral compass will be sharpened, our appreciation for what we have will be heightened, and that our awareness of our privilege comes with responsibilities beyond our borders will be more than well honed. For now, let us have the courage to be influenced by this pandemic and students of its teachings, even when the teachings and the homework are gut-wrenching. Through this, we can strengthen who we are as spiritual people. And when we ring that church bell again, and we are able to gather, and we will ring the church bell, we will be a stronger community. Thank you for joining us today. As always, I'm open to your thoughts, your comments, your observations. You can reach me at president@uubelmont.org. That's .org, not .com. And I will be very glad to hear from you. We will schedule another town hall meeting after the first of the year, likely, and hopefully we'll have more medical news that we can use to be able to have a different discussion and to shape our future. But for now, thank you for joining us. Stay engaged and be safe, and have a good afternoon.